Very few people in the Eastern Orthodox Church know much about Hank Hanegraaff, the so-called Bible answer man who stunned the world by recently converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. If you're one of those people who knows nothing about him, then you're in luck. I have on the phone with me the man who literally wrote the book on Hanegraaff. The book is called Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff and his takeover of the Christian Research Institute. The author is Jay Howard, founder of the Religious Research Project in Logan, Ohio. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's nice to be with you.
Jay, I want to start with the subtitle of your book. The subtitle is Hank Hanegraaff and his takeover of the Christian Research Institute. Let's just abbreviate Christian Research Institute to CRI for the rest of the show.
Sure.
Okay, Jay, the guy who founded the Christian Research Institute is actually not Hank Hanegraaff, but no one would know that if you went to the website of CRI, would you?
No, I talked to a lot of people over the years who think that Hank Hanegraaff is the founder of CRI, and in fact, to kind of give you a little idea of this, back in 2002, a friend of mine was doing a radio interview with him, and they were talking about the Bible Answer Man program itself. And he said, "Well, who is the radio fellow?" Asked him, "Who is the original Bible Answer Man?" And Hank answered something like, "Well, there's been many men behind the microphone, but I'm the current Bible Answer Man." And this is a pattern that he had for many years, where he went out of his way not to mention Walter Martin, because Walter Martin was the Bible Answer Man. He started the show back in the 60s. And
and he's the founder of CRI as well.
Yeah, CRI. Yeah, okay. He started the CRI in his basement in New Jersey back in 1960. They moved out to California in about 74, 75, when Martin realized that all the major cult issues going on in the United States were kind of coming out of California and going east.
Imagine that, cults coming from California. Who'd have thunk it?
And so he kind of thought that, being at the heart of the cult world would be the best place to be for a ministry like CRI, which is heavy into cult apologetics. So they moved out there in 73 or 74, 75 time period, and of course Martin, ran the ministry for from 1960 till 89 when he died, and unfortunately he didn't really leave a will or anything about who would succeed him. And so it was kind of up in the air as to who would take Martin's place if he was to retire or die.
And so who did take his place?
Well, it was obviously Hank Hanegraaff. I remember getting a newsletter from CRI in 89 or late 89, early 90 that had a little blurb in the middle of it talking about a guy named Hank Hanegraaff who was going to take the ministry forward into the future. And at that time, I had never heard of him. I mean, I know a lot of people in the cult and apologetics world because I'm in this field myself, and I had honestly never heard of Hank Hanegraaff, and I just assumed he was some kind of some seminarian that Walter Martin was impressed with and kind of came out of nowhere. I knew nothing about him at that point.
Okay, you thought he was a seminarian, which is what most people would have thought, but in fact, your book says that he was really just some kind of a bean counter there at CRI.
Yeah, if you, I got a hold of his resume for the book, and the book talks about different ministries that he supposedly worked for. He helped raise money for them and this kind of thing. There is no mention in his bio that CRI had that said anything about him being any kind of a theologian, having any seminary or Bible college training in the field of cults and philosophy and apologetics. There's nothing like that in his biographical statement.
So what was he doing at CRI? Was he I think you said in the book that he was a fundraiser, and that's why Walter Martin brought him onto the board.
Yeah, see, Walter Martin would go to a church called Mount Perrin Church of God in Atlanta, Georgia, where the pastor really liked him about once a year. And at that time, Hank Hanegraaff was attending Mount Perrin in Atlanta, and that's when he first met Walter Martin. He started talking to him and kind of promoting himself to Walter Martin. And so they met a couple of years before he got involved at CRI, back in the 80s.
Okay, so he met Hank Hanegraaff in Atlanta, and then that's where he decided to bring him on board as a fundraiser. So Hank Hanegraaff ended up getting onto the board, and I read in the book that the board comprised all of 3 people aside from Walter Martin. That's rather unusual.
Yeah, from what I could see, for several years, Martin kept a very lean board, usually 4 or 5 people, hardly ever more than 5. And at the time of his death in June of '89, there was only 3 other men on the board besides himself, and Hank Hanegraaff had been one of those men.
Jay, the book gives a rather scandalous description of some of the shenanigans that went on at Walter Martin's funeral. Why don't you sketch that funeral for us and let us know what happened there?
Okay. Well, the family and the board members were in a room. If you've been part of a funeral before, there's always a room where the people involved in the funeral, the relatives, that kind of thing, they sit in this room until they're called to go to sit in the front of the church. And so Walter Martin's immediate family, his board, John Ankerberg, Hank Hanegraaff, they were in this room together. It was a handful of people, literally. And a few minutes before they were to be ushered into the church, Hank Hanegraaff approached Darlene Martin, who was Walter Martin's widow, and asked to see her funeral notes. So she was in a state of shock, and she wasn't going to doubt the guy because she trusted him. So she handed his notes to Hank Hanegraaff, and Hanegraaff took them to another man that she remembers handing the notes to this other man, and he wrote something on the paper on the bottom of her funeral notes. And so he came back a couple minutes later and said, "Read this note, once you finish reading your prepared typed out speech." And so she just tucked it in there at the bottom and took it with her. And when she got to her prepared statement, typed out statement, she read that about her husband and his ministry. And then I've listened to the audio tapes of the funeral, and right when she hits this prepared statement that he had written down, I mean, not that he had written down, but somebody else had written for her in cursive writing, she started to stammer a little bit because she was trying to read it for the first time in her life. And the note and I have this note because she sent me a photocopy of this handwritten note that was at the bottom of her statement.
It's also reproduced in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book, and in that she started talking about how her and Walter had talked many times about who would take over CRI once he died or retired, and then she launched into this, and that man is Hank Hanegraaff, and we thank God for Hank Hanegraaff, and Hank Hanegraaff is a great guy, and he's going to do this, he's going to do that, and so it was really kind of a mini commercial for Hank Hanegraaff that she had not even prepared. It was Hanegraaff's own statement that he literally wanted read into the funeral notes, into the recordings and the videotaping of the funeral, so that it would appear that she was giving her imprimatur, her pledge of loyalty to Hank, that he was the man that Walter Martin had chosen. Now, I interviewed Darlene Martin several times over the course of putting this book together, and she told me something very interesting, that when Walter Martin would come home at night, from CRI, he wanted to be just father and a husband. She said that he never would talk about what's going on in the ministry, who we're hiring, who we're firing, nothing about the stuff they're going to be doing. And so she didn't know anything about Hanegraaff. There was no talking, in bed, hanging around with Walter Martin, in the wee hours of the morning, talking about what would happen if he died. That was all made up. Hanegraaff just created this whole image out of whole cloth to make it look like there had been thought put into his being chosen as the president, when in actuality there was no advanced warning that he would become president of CRI.
Just a classic example of opportunism.
Yeah, he had this. I don't know. I think he started building this case for himself in his head, because he got on the board of CRI in February of 1987, which is about a year and a half or so before Walter Martin died. And so he was on the board with those other men, Stan Thompson and Everett Jacobson, and then Walter Martin. So he'd only been on the board for a little over a year and a half when Martin died unexpectedly of diabetic complications.
And you indicated in the book that the handwriting expert whom you hired to look at that note indicated that might actually have been John Ankerberg's handwriting.
Yeah, it's there was only a handful of people in this room. No, none of the relatives would have written this note because it was obviously not true. Darlene, I had Darlene's handwriting checked out. It wasn't her handwriting, so we know she didn't write it herself. Hank, I don't think would have been foolish enough to put it in his handwriting, and so the only person that I could see that would possibly have been the writer of this was John Ankerberg. Now I don't know for sure. I tried to contact the Ankerberg Ministries to get a statement from him about what had transpired, but he never did get back to me. I don't think he wants to deal with this any longer. It's it's kind of old history to him, and even if his handwriting is the writing, which I think it is. That doesn't mean that he was conspiring with Hank Hanegraaff. I think he was just trying to help the family somehow, or maybe help Hank. He wouldn't have said, "Here, we're going to put one over on Darlene, so write this down for me."
Yeah, we got to make sure people know that John Ankerberg and Walter Martin were like brothers. Those two. Walter Martin debated on the John Ankerberg show innumerable times.
Exactly, Ankerberg and Martin were more like Paul and Timothy. Ankerberg is a little bit younger than he is, and he loved Walter Martin, so he would not willingly have participated in any kind of a ruse, to hurt CRI or to hurt the Martin family. So whatever Hanegraaff said to him, and I believe it was said to Hanegraaff or to Ankerberg, it must have been some kind of a lie, a way of making it look like he was helping out the family, helping out Hanegraaff, whatever, but it was not. I don't think Ankerberg would have participated in any kind of a conspiracy to defraud Darlene Martin.
And the note in question is reproduced on pages 129 to 130 of the book. Now, just to set the tenor of what Hanegraaff's regime was going to be like when he took over the Christian Research Institute, his first action as president apparently was to hike his salary?
That was one of the very first, yeah. Walter Martin, at the time of his death, was making the princely sum of $40,000 a year, which is really nothing, when you think about being the head of an organization. And the first thing that Hanegraaff asked the board for was a $20,000 raise from $40,000 to $60,000. That was his first move within the first month of him being there.
Ladies and gentlemen, the book is called Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff and his takeover of the Christian Research Institute. The author is Jay Howard. Jay, I want to read a quote from your book because I think that it starkly contrasts exactly what kind of ministry Hank Hanegraaff was going to run, and I think it starkly contrasts his character with that of his far worthier predecessor, Walter Martin. The quote's found on page 59. Quote, "From July 1989 until 1995, over 100 people were either fired or felt compelled to quit under Hank Hanegraaff. All of this in only the first 6 years of Hank Hanegraaff's Machiavellian control of CRI. But Hanegraaff's presidency, which would be marked by avarice and an almost maniacal need for self-promotion, had just begun. There is no record of Walter Martin firing staff during his tenure at CRI over a 30-year period." End of quotation.
Yeah, I didn't know Walter Martin. I mean, I've met him several times, but I didn't know him really well. I don't think he could have picked me out in a crowd, to tell you the truth. But he was always a very jovial, happy, lovable fellow. And I've talked to many of his employees, since after the book came out and before the book came out, and nobody was saying he was tyrannical, that he had a bad temper or anything. So it's hard for me to believe that Martin ever fired pretty much anybody unless they had some kind of a real need to be fired. But when Hanegraaff came in, he was so insecure. He didn't have, he had no real apologetics cult philosophy education. He had a high school diploma and quite a bit of college at Calvary College, Calvary College in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah, I think he wrote Calvin College.
Yeah, it was a Dutch Reform School. And so, but the transcripts show that he never even graduated from a Bible college. He left short of graduation.
So he just meandered his way through college without even finishing, whereas the researchers at CRI had to have degrees, and he was going to be president of all of these degreed people.
Yeah, at the time that Hanegraaff took over, it was a requirement that if you wanted to be a research person, I'm not talking about a secretary or something, but if you wanted to be a research person, you had to have at least a bachelor's degree, working on a master's, etc. And if you had a high school diploma, that wouldn't cut it as a research person. So yeah, Hanegraaff came in and took over a very highly educated ministry with less than a college degree. And that's one of my points in my book that I make, that I reason that a man like Hanegraaff, who knew pretty much all the evangelical scholars of the day, the most brilliant Christian minds of America at that time, if he was picking a successor, he would not have picked a person with a high school diploma. I mean, I don't care how nice the guy was, it just wouldn't be part of his makeup to pick a person with limited knowledge in the field that CRI was involved in.
And he wouldn't pick somebody who would alienate everyone on the staff and then go on to alienate many other people in the Christian world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, to put this into some perspective, Hanegraaff appears to people that he's trying to get close to, like Walter Martin or D. James Kennedy, as a very nice person, a very pleasant fellow. He likes to get close to people. He likes to, use the term "suck up." He would, try to get close to Christian leaders because he liked being around that kind of power. And so, if he wants to get close to you, he's going to schmooze you. He's going to be your best buddy. He's going to flatter you. There would be no sign that he would have this rather deplorable side of him that was insecure and angry and would fire you with a drop of a hat. That was not evident to Walter Martin, of course.
And of course, Walter Martin wasn't that way at all. When I talk about Walter Martin on my podcasts, I usually refer to him as the legendary Walter Martin, because he is indeed a legend from his writings and all of his seminars and his audio tapes. But more than that, Walter Martin was beloved. People who knew him just loved him.
I think that's a very fair statement, yeah. I mean, I think everybody who's in modern-day Christian cults and apologetic ministry here in America can look to Walter Martin as sort of the father of the modern, what you can call the Christian counter-cult movement in America. I, for one, I read Kingdom of the Cults, which is his opus work he wrote in 1962, the original Kingdom of the Cults. I bought that in 1976, about a year after I started researching cults, and I read every chapter of that book. I fell in love with that book. I started listening to the tapes. I get tapes of his. I mean, anything that Walter Martin would write, I would purchase. And I got my love of cults and my interest in reaching out to this field of ministry from his love of the people who are lost in cults and the occult.
Jay, we've been talking about the people whom Hanegraaff terminated at CRI. On pages 39 to 43 of your book, you give a list, necessarily a partial list, but still a long list, of some of the people whom Hanegraaff fired. Let's go through some of these and just find out what the reasons were behind the firings, beginning with our mutual friend, Perry Robinson.
Well, Perry, I don't know Perry personally. In fact, most of the men of CRI and even the women, I've never met personally. I met a handful of them personally, but most of them are just, people to me. I mean, that I have never really worked with.
But you've interacted with them in correspondence and so forth. Yeah,
like Robert Bowman and Paul Cardin I know personally. Perry Robinson, he worked in the correspondence processing department, I guess, for a while. He had some problems because at the time that he was working for them, they were Hank Hanegraaff was kind of moving towards and trying to legitimize a cultic system in California called Set Free Ministries, written by started by Phil Aguilar. And by that time, when Hanegraaff came aboard, CRI was very concerned about Phil Aguilar's group. They considered it abusive, maybe perhaps not totally cultic, but it was a very abusive group, and they were not in favor of it at all. But apparently, funds started flowing in from Phil Aguilar's people, and contributions for CRI, and these checks, according to Perry Robinson, were not sent to his department, but they were sent directly to Hank Hanegraaff's office to be opened by Hank Hanegraaff alone, and this drew Perry's concern. And when he tried to protest this idea, he was fired.
Well, God forbid a Christian ministry should be financially responsible. Jay, tell me about Robert Bowman.
Well, Rob Bowman I've known for quite a while. He told me about his CRI experience with Hank Hanegraaff. That I think the turning point for Rob was one day Hank Hanegraaff was on the Hank Hanegraaff was on the Bible Answer Man program, and he was quoting from what's called a CRI perspective, I believe, which is like a one-page sheet on a group.
And let's make sure we're clear. This is after the death of Walter Martin.
Oh yeah, this is after the death of Walter Martin. And Rob Bowman had written that particular perspective. It's like the one-page outline of a group's theology and history, that kind of thing. And according to Rob, what he told me was Hanegraaff read that on the air as if he had written it. He took credit for writing it. And Rob Bowman went into his office a little later after the show and said, you can't do that because I wrote that. I mean, I know I wrote that because that's my writing. And Hanegraaff sort of protested a little bit, and it wasn't until a week later Bowman kind of found out what happened. He was fired. He was fired from CRI and told they had a financial problem that month, and they had to let some people go. Now, Rob actually went back into the numbers of that month and found out that, in truth, the giving for that month was actually higher than normal for the year, and he was the only one fired. So it wasn't like a massive group of people let go on that particular week. And the people you don't let go when you're having trouble are the people that keep your ministry going. The research department. He was a researcher, one of the top researchers at that time, and so they fired him. So it was a retribution firing for doubting or challenging Hank Hanegraaff.
Jay, tell me about Craig and Lisa Hawkins.
Well, Lisa, I think she worked in she was a secretary there, I believe, but Craig was one of the senior researchers. In fact, many times when Walter Martin was out of town for a weekend or something, or for a couple of days, he had Craig fill in as the voice of the Bible Answer Man for a day or two. And Craig's another one of those people I have met in the past. I don't really hang out with him too much anymore. He lives in Santa Ana, California, I believe. But he's a very gifted speaker. He has a background in philosophy and cults and world religions, and so he was really good at getting behind a microphone and taking calls and questions because he had such a broad knowledge of the Bible and philosophy and Christian apologetics, something that Walter Martin had. And so Craig Hawkins spent many days being the voice of the Bible Answer Man when Walter Martin died. After, and there was like Ken Samples, Rob Bowman, Paul Carden. There was about a half dozen men that filled in, but Craig did it a lot. And to be the president of CRI, you'd have to be the voice of the Bible Answer Man. I mean, it's you couldn't be the president of CRI and not be the voice of the Bible Answer Man program. So Hanegraaff understood that he had to do something to get rid of Craig Hawkins. In fact, he told people before the firings and after the firings that his wife Kathy had a dream or something, and God had told her that Craig Hawkins he was like demon possessed.
Have thou nothing to do with that righteous man, in other words.
Yeah, and so they fired Craig Hawkins, I should say they forced him out, made it terribly uncomfortable for him to be there, because, Hanegraaff, again, he needed to be the Bible Answer Man voice, and Craig Hawkins was probably the one man who could stand between him and that chair. So he got rid of Craig Hawkins. He feared Craig Hawkins in a sense, because most of these men, I think he was living in fear that they would figure out how bad he was, how limited background he had in cults and philosophy and the Bible and everything else. And so he little by little got rid of pretty much everybody who had a real background in these kinds of things, who had studied them, gone to college for these issues. And so little by little, most of the men were sort of moved out of the CRI or outright fired. And Craig Hawkins was one of those.
Jay, let's switch gears here from firing and talk about hiring. Tell me about this Paul Young character whom Hank Hanegraaff brought on board.
Well, Paul Young was a Canadian. He'd met him up in Canada, because there's a thing called CRI Canada, which was started about 10 years before Walter Martin died. And so Hanegraaff went up there after Martin died to check out CRI Canada, met with John Teeb, the director of CRI Canada, and he ended up firing John Teeb and the whole staff that was up there, because they were not too happy with the way he was running things, and they became very concerned. So John Teeb was let go, and it was kind of a bloodbath up there. But he did meet Paul Young. They must have hit it off somehow, because he invited him to come down to Southern California to be his right hand man, to be the vice president of CRI. The only problem was, at that time, Paul Young was married to a woman by the name of Estelle, and he literally picked up, moved down to Southern California, left his wife in Canada, left her with the bills and all the problems of what happens when you leave your spouse. She called down to CRI to talk to Hank Hanegraaff privately about the desertion of her husband to work for CRI, and she went public on this, and she said that Hanegraaff would never take her phone calls and never would help her to reconcile with her husband. So he literally took on a man who had abandoned his family.
And I do believe the Bible says a man who will not provide for his family is worse than an infidel. Well,
exactly. You have a man, the head of the CRI, this Christian research organization, that is actually, basically breaking with biblical statements. You don't help a man or a woman flee their family when they're responsible to their mate. This was a marriage. This wasn't boyfriend girlfriend. This was a marriage, and Hanegraaff completely disregarded that relationship and took Paul on and left his ex-wife to flounder by herself.
The name of the book, ladies and gentlemen, is Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff and his takeover of the Christian Research Institute. The author is Jay Howard. Jay is on the phone with me right now. Jay, having established who the real founder of CRI is, we need to stress again, I think this is a very important point to stress, that Hank Hanegraaff is also not the original Bible Answer Man, as we have been detailing. Let's talk about Walter Martin. We had mentioned that Walter Martin had trained up a number of competent men to team host the Bible Answer Man in his absence, or even to co-host with him, because even as expansively knowledgeable as Walter Martin was, he knew he didn't have all knowledge. So we've talked about he had men like Craig Hawkins, Ken Samples, I think it was Paul Carden, you said.
Yeah, and there was Ron Rhodes who I think was working
Ron
on his
Rhodes.
doctorate, when he was working for Walter Martin. You had Ken Samples, you had Rob Bowman. Craig Hawkins was one of the main men that would appear into the microphone when Martin was out of town. So he had probably about a half dozen guys who were his go-to men, who would sometimes there'd be 2 or 3 people in the booth answering questions when Walter was out of town.
And yet, the person who took over the program was the person least qualified to do so, Hank Hanegraaff.
Exactly. In fact, there's a little story that appears in the book. There was a good friend of Walter Martin's by the name of Tony Collaril, perhaps. And I interviewed him back in, I think, 2001, 2002 when I was working on the book, research. And he told me a little interesting story. He said that they had a dedication of their building. The CRI had a dedication of their building in Irvine, California, and Tony Collarel came out to attend the little shindig. And while he was there, Walter Martin had invited him to go to a Baptist church with him because Walter Martin had been booked to speak there. And I think it was in I want to say Garden Grove or Garden City, one of those towns. So they get in the car, and they're driving away. And Tony told me that Walter, he was asking him about how things are going at CRI, and Walter started waxing eloquent about several men there that had sort of showed themselves to be superior Christian leaders there. He mentioned Paul Cardin, he said. He mentioned Craig Hawkins by name. He might have mentioned Rich Paul, who was there for a time. And he was talking about all these young men who he had hired to be researchers at CRI. And it just so happened that driving to the church engagement, the man driving was Hank Hanegraaff, and he was behind the wheel. Now, I asked him, did he say anything about Hank Hanegraaff? Did he say how wonderful he was and this is going to be my next president of CRI or whatever if something happened to me? And Tony said no. I mean, the guy drove the car, and there was no extolling of Hank Hanegraaff's credentials to him. Now, the reason this is significant is because Tony Collaril, and I've heard this from other people, they were really good friends. I mean, Tony and Walter were good friends, had been friends for many, many years.
Back in New Jersey, because that's where Walter Martin was originally from. And if you're going to be driving, you're going to be driving to this church thing, and you're at the dedication, you've come all this way to see your friend Walter. I think this would be a great time to discuss with him and saying, hey, who's driving this car right now? The man who's going to take over for me after I die or if I retire, Hank Hanegraaff. He's the man, and he's driving this car right now. And this is why he's so wonderful. But he didn't say one word about Hank Hanegraaff, and to me that would have been the perfect time to discuss the future with his friend Tony. And I just think that's indicative of one of the reasons why Hanegraaff is not or should not have been the president, because Walter Martin has said nothing about him to anybody that I can find, in public or private. I interviewed many people. None of them had any advanced knowledge of Hank Hanegraaff going to be the next president. It just wasn't in the cards. So the men whom Walter Martin mentored and trained all got canned, whereas the chauffeur/fundraiser is the one who ended up becoming president of CRI and the Bible Answer Man.
Exactly.
Yeah, Jay, you've got a priceless quote about this on page 29. I want to read it. Quote, Hank was given authority by the board to build the BAM program by adding or subtracting radio stations in order to make the BAM program profitable. This, again, was only a business-related project. He was not being asked to appear on BAM and had never spent any time on the radio show at that point. To put this into perspective, it would be analogous to a business manager at a hospital being offered the position as the head of thoracic medicine. It would never happen because the manager has no training in that field, end quote.
Exactly. You bring on board people who are trained in the field that they're good at, and since Hanegraaff was known as a bookkeeping type person, a fundraising type person, and that's how he sold his involvement at CRI. He sold it to Walter Martin because let's be real clear about this. Ministries like mine, anybody's ministry, we need funds. We know we need funds. We're not really good at raising funds, but money makes the world go round. So Walter Martin, if he had one deficit in his life, he was not a good fundraiser. And he was looking for somebody like a Hank Hanegraaff to come alongside him. And I think Hanegraaff recognizes in him that he needed a fundraiser, and that's how he sold him to get involved at CRI. There was no indication. In fact, one of the things that really sets this book apart, actually there is no other book. I mean, this is the world's best-selling book on Hank Hanegraaff in the entire world, because nobody else has ever written a book like this. Nobody. And so one of the things that makes this work is because one of Martin's board members, his name was Stan Tonneson. He just died here a couple months ago. He was a great guy. I mean, I met with him in 2008. I flew down to Fort Myers, Florida, to spend a week with him and his wife. And Stan had saved pretty much everything that he was ever given from CRI. He had notes, and he had minutes from board meetings. He had, boxes and boxes of stuff. And so I was able to take all the board minutes that Stan still possessed at CRI or from CRI home with me, and I took a big, thick briefcase with me and stuffed full of notes, and I took it home. And in the book itself, I quote from several board minutes of different years that Hanegraaff was on. He was on there from February of '87 until he took over in '89, June of '89. Now, if you read these board minutes, you'll notice that there is, any time that Hanegraaff speaks up in a board meeting, it's related to business, fundraising, going on a cruise, raising money to go on a cruise for CRI people or whatever it was. There was all kinds of projects and things he talked about, but he was never talking about, being the BAM guy or being a theologian, working with the research crew. He was always talking about raising money, cutting costs, very accounting-related stories.
Yeah, he was just counting the shekels, in other words.
Yeah.
Now, some people may be puzzled at this point, because if you listen to Hanegraaff on the radio now, he's a smooth operator. And I think just by dint of longevity, he has become so. But that wasn't always the case. When he first took over on the Bible Answer Man, it was a daily disaster. And Jay, you have a letter here that you've reproduced in the book by Michael Stevens, former director of broadcast media at CRI. I just want to read a couple of the choice sentences from this, and you can jump in at any point.
Sure.
Okay, here we are on page 53. Quote, "Never did a BAM broadcast go by without Hank rewording a caller's question to enable himself to answer the reworded question. Hank would usually ask, 'Does that help?' or something along those lines, and the response by the caller was often something like, 'Well, actually,' in which Hank would say, 'Well, stay on the line and we'll send you some information,' and not ever really answering the question, probably due to ignorance," end quote. Moving down, quote, "There were also two of the unfortunate things that happened on the Bible Answer Man quite regularly. The first is this: Hank would walk into the studio, briefly scan the pre-screened call sheets, and then scramble to find a quick fix answer. Oftentimes, he would ask Ron Rhodes or Bob Lyle what this or that word meant, or what that cult believes. Some of the questions to which Hank had no answer were frighteningly simple. I must say that he didn't always do this. The sad fact is that when he didn't, the answer would often be wrong," end quote. All right, so he's depending on Ron Rhodes and Bob Lyle there, two of the men we said earlier were probably qualified to sit in as the actual Bible Answer Man.
Yeah. Also, I've talked to a couple of the radio people there, and they said they created a book with, tabs, so you could open the book to a tab, say Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would have like statements in there about Jehovah's Witnesses, so he could pull information. Now, one of the radio guys, I want to say it was Michael, but I'm not sure if it was that, had told me that he had actually given him a device to use on the air. He gave Hank Hanegraaff a device where he'd be reading something off the page, and he'd stammer and stop and make it look like he was pulling it all from memory. And so when he would be quoting a source from Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or something, he was trying to make it sound like he was, he had this already memorized, he would stop and stammer and like he was like fighting to pull it out of his memory. And so he would use these little devices to make himself look good on the air.
The name of the book is Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff and his takeover of the Christian Research Institute. The author is Jay Howard. Jay, it's fun for us to ridicule Hank Hanegraaff's foibles, but there's a sense in which this really infuriates me. I mean, there's steam coming out of my ears right now. Let me tell you where I'm coming from, Jay. I was raised Southern Baptist. That's the same denomination in which Walter Martin had his ordination. So I drifted away as a preteen, but in my very early 20s, I came back to the faith. I was reading the books of Josh McDowell. I was reading one of McDowell's books. It was called Answers to Tough Questions Skeptics Ask About the Christian Faith. In the chapter on the Trinity, McDowell had placed an endnote that cited an audio tape called Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Trinity, recorded by somebody I'd never heard of, Walter Martin. Okay, this is the early 90s, before the internet was big, so I didn't get online and look up the Christian Research Institute. I sent a letter to them. I got a hold of that tape, and when I played it, I was like, man, this is coin of the realm. From that point, for many, many months to follow, anytime I got a paycheck, I sent a goodly portion of that to CRI just so I could get some more Walter Martin tapes. I learned theology from Walter Martin's tape catalog. This story can be replicated by innumerable people across the English-speaking world. They learned theology from Walter Martin. I mean, his tapes have this kind of miraculous power. It's almost like Chuck Smith tapes. You hear the stories of the Chuck Smith tapes that somebody finds in the apartment complex dumpster, pulls them out, starts listening, gets born again. People get born again listening to Chuck Smith tapes. They learn theology from Walter Martin. I'm sure that since you work in the counter-cult industry, you probably have a similar affectionate view of Walter Martin that I do.
Yeah, I had mentioned that. I read Kingdom of the Cults when I was about 20. My first encounter with a Mooney was in '75 when I was a freshman in college, and that got me interested in cults. And so I read Kingdom of the Cults in 1976. Got hooked on Walter Martin. Listened to his tapes. I was like you. I bought his tapes. Anytime he came out with a new book, I tried to read that book. And I learned an appreciation for reaching out to the cults and to the people who are involved in false teachings through the love that Walter Martin had for these people in his books. I mean, it was pretty clear that he this was not just a career for him. This was his ministry that God had given him. And so, like you had mentioned, this can be duplicated and replicated multiple times because almost everybody I know who does this full time in Christian ministry around the country has some knowledge that Walter Martin was partially or totally the reason they got involved in this area of ministry. So, his ministry has had wide-ranging effects on people.
But you, Jay, unlike me, actually knew Walter Martin, at least informally, and sat under his teachings live and in color.
Right. Yeah, I actually moved to California in '78 to go to Melodyland, which he was teaching at, so I could sit in his cults class. It didn't work out too well for me, but I went to his Bible class on Sundays. He had a Bible class at Melodyland, and I sat, in the first 3 or 4 rows, and he would do his talk for the day, and it was just incredibly wonderful. I never really, I didn't have this need to be around him all the time. I wasn't trying to schmooze him. I wasn't trying to be his best friend, but I really respected him. So even though I didn't have like a personal contact with him, personal relationship with him, I met him and shook his hand a handful of times in different years that I encountered him. But yeah, I never was, I was not trying to reach out and be his friend.
We need to emphasize, too, that in this industry in which you labor, that's the counter-cult ministry, Walter Martin was basically the pioneer. He and a man named Jan Karel van Balen. All of us, we basically owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Walter Martin and, by extension, Jan Karel van Balen. And I want to tell you, Jay, when I was in my early 20s, I was so into Walter Martin's materials that I would go to evening Bible studies and I would regale people by quoting Walter Martin verbatim. I would quote his sentences word for word, and not only that, I would imitate his intonation. That's how influential Walter Martin was on me. In my later years, I gravitated more towards Eastern Christianity, so theologically I departed from Martin on a handful of issues. But did that reduce the respect I had for him? Not a bit. Did that respect the feelings of affection that I have for Walter Martin? Not even a little bit. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church, to which Walter Martin's quote-unquote successor has converted, there's this notion that everybody has to have a spiritual father. That's a priest or an abbot to whom one is accountable and who gives one authorization to do this or that. So in this arena, when somebody accusatorily asks me, who's your spiritual father? I just say, Walter Martin. Uncle Walt, that's my spiritual father. Now, as I was saying, this angers me because Walter Martin, he was funny, he was expansively knowledgeable, and on top of that, he was original. We talked about him pioneering this field. Now, the person who succeeded for him is exactly the opposite. He's bland, but on top of that, he is completely unoriginal. And so Hank Hanegraaff yanks this ministry out from underneath all the men who should have been the successors of Walter Martin and gives it to himself.
Well, no, that's exactly the way it was because, he positioned himself. He was a vice president on the board, which means nothing in real terms because I've sat on boards, and just because you're the vice president of a ministry board doesn't mean that you have the knowledge to actually sit in that seat in the real ministry world. That's just a position that he held on the board, and he may have worked with, talked Everett Jacobson and Stan into letting him be the president for a while because he thought, well, maybe if he may have said, well, I'll be the president for a while until we can find somebody to take my place.
Just a caretaker president.
Just to keep it going. Now, I think it's worth noting, too, that, they didn't wait until weeks or months after the funeral to make him president. Hank Hanegraaff called a special meeting at 8:45 in the morning, the day of the funeral, and had them vote on his presidency. Now, who needs to have a new president, the morning of the funeral? But I believe that he was struggling to consolidate his power as soon as possible, so nobody could fight him on it. And then, of course, he had John Ankerberg during the funeral announce that he was unanimously voted on as president of CRI or for CRI in the morning. But you just don't have a business meeting the morning of the funeral of the founder. It's unheard of.
Unanimously voted by 3 people, Hanegraaff being one of the 3 people.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
and so, everything he did was seemingly calculated to consolidate his power as quickly as he could.
As much as that makes the steam come out of my ears, I got to admit, there's a part of me that admires that level of piracy. Just being able to pull off a feat like that, there's something, I mean, it's admirable in a deplorable way, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, we call it, chutzpah. That the Yiddish term chutzpah.
Oh yeah.
He had a lot of chutzpah just to think that he could even try to make this work. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, he's not an original person. He could never have started the CRI himself. So the only way he could make it in the world was to, take over an existing ministry. And as I've shown in the book on several pages, even before he supposedly became a Christian in 1979, Hanegraaff admitted that he wanted to have money and power. He craved to have a lot of money, and so he used CRI as his personal ATM machine. I mean, the guy is making in excess of $400,000, him and his wife, because she's supposed to be the head of public relations.
Yeah, what exactly does she do? She makes $80,000. What does Kathy Hanegraaff do?
Well, I don't think anybody's ever able to figure that out, because when I was working on the book, I talked to people, and they said she was never around. If she was doing PR work, she was doing it from her home because she had like 8 or 9 kids or something. But she never was in the office working. She was always doing it supposedly at home. So, we don't really know how she worked or what she worked on, but this is what she was supposed to be doing. But, between that and the, I'm sure he has the expense account, so he probably has another, 100. I've heard it's closer to 600,000 now, because my book, when it came out, it was about 400,000.
Jay, we talked about how Hanegraaff stole CRI. Apparently, even before he came onto CRI, he began his ministry career with a ripoff. You've interviewed D. James Kennedy, and apparently Hanegraaff stole from him as well. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah. I interviewed D. James Kennedy in 2000 because at that time Hanegraaff was going on the radio and claiming that D. James Kennedy was an astrologer, and trying to mess up D. James Kennedy's ministry career by claiming that he was a heretic and an astrologer. So I called Hanegraaff's office and set up an interview with him, and because it became pretty clear at that time that Hanegraaff had stolen or plagiarized material from what's called Evangelism Explosion, which is sort of the opus work of D. James Kennedy back in the 60s or 70s, I think. And so I called D. James Kennedy's office and talked to him for 10 minutes, and we talked about how he knew about the plagiarism. He was very concerned about it. He wasn't going to sue him. He wasn't going to take him to court because Christians don't sue Christians, he told me, which is pretty biblical.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 6.
Yeah, and so, but Hanegraaff knew that he knew about it, and he tried to, he met him at a hotel one time, and sort of, kind of, a little bit pleaded with him not to, do anything, and Kennedy told him, "Don't worry, I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to make a big deal out of this." But Kennedy was routinely being sent copies of the PWT, comparing it to E
That's
material.
personal witness training.
Yeah, personal witness training, and that's Hanegraaff's material, and it was really close. Now, Rob Bowman back in '95 did a point-by-point comparison, which I replicate, I think, most of it in my book.
And just to remind the listeners, Rob Bowman was the CRI employee who actually wrote the CRI perspectives.
Right. Now, so he did this point-by-point comparison to show that the plagiarism was real, and it really was. I mean, it's so blatant that it could not have been just a coincidence, And so yeah, he's written several books, but they were always been written by committee or by other people.
He being Hanegraaff.
Hanegraaff, and he put his name on it. So
yeah,
the guy just
that's extremely interesting, Jay, because I'm not the biggest fan of Hanegraaff's books, but the one that I actually did like was Christianity in Crisis, and it turns out that's written by committee.
Yeah, CRI staffers.
Yeah, CRI staffers. And we talked about the CRI perspectives. Hanegraaff is also known for his collaborations with quote-unquote co-authors. I'm putting that in quotation marks because apparently the co-author is just the author, and Hanegraaff's name gets tacked on for sales purposes. Is that what I'm to understand from your books?
Yeah, I would say that by putting Hanegraaff's name on it because it's better known, books would sell better. But people would write these books like the novelist is it Bauer?
Sigmund Bauer.
Yeah,
Sigmund Bauer.
He wrote 3 or 4 novels on early Christianity before 70 AD. Hanegraaff had come out as a preterist a few years ago.
Explain what that is.
Preterism is an eschatological position that pretty much the end times came to a complete end in 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed.
Okay, and there are reputable theologians who accept that position, so it's not necessarily a bad position.
But it's a minority position.
Right, it's a minority position.
Terribly minority. But see, at that time that he was putting these books out, the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye were just flying off the shelves, and I know from what I found out, Tim LaHaye and his partner made about $60 million on the series of books, the films that came out. And so, again, my idea would be that preterism, he thought, well, if I come out on believing in preterism, I tell people I believe in preterism, I can work on a series of novels about the early church from a preterist position.
From a different angle from Tim LaHaye.
Yeah, because he was a pre-tribulationist, and preterism is not that; it's something different. So I think he became a preterist so he could write these novels with his co-author to kind of take advantage of the financial windfall that came from the Left Behind series. I mean, that's how he was thinking. He was thinking these could be as popular as the Left Behind series, and I'll make it millions of dollars, which I don't think they ever were as popular, of course. But that's why I believe he became a preterist, because it was financially lucrative for him, or he thought it would be financially lucrative for him.
So based on the data that we have on Hanegraaff, you're inferring that he saw that Tim LaHaye was making big money on this particular genre, so he wanted in on the genre but knew he had to have a different angle, and therefore he cynically adopted this minority position for financial reasons.
That's the only thing I can conclude, because I figured it out while I was doing I did about 10 years of research on Hanegraaff for this book, from 99 till about 2009. And
that's a long time to be in Hanegraaff's head.
Yeah, tell me about it. Whoa. But I kind of came to the conclusion that Hanegraaff never makes a move unless he asks himself, what can Hank Hanegraaff get out of this move that I'm going to take? Whether it's a theological position or whether he moves across country, whatever he does it by asking, what is he going to get out of it? That's the way he thinks.
Jay, our time is running down here. I want to talk about the final chapter of the book. In this book, you very strongly imply that Hanegraaff took another theological position for rather dubious reasons, and this is dealing with a group known as the local church, which the Christian Research Institute under Walter Martin had condemned as a cult. But I guess it was the early 2000s, CRI under Hanegraaff and Answers in Action under Gretchen Passantino decided that the local church was not a cult. Could you give us the details on that?
Well, the local church came out of China. A fellow by the name of Witness Lee, who was a disciple of Watchman Nee, started it. And every Christian ministry that I know of that deals with cults considers it a Christian cult. And so when CRI came out and said we were wrong about this, in fact, they put out a journal that the title is on the cover, "We Were Wrong, a reassessment of the local church movement of Watchman Nee and Witness Lee." And so they went to China. Hank Hanegraaff went to China, I think took a small team with him, toured China, met a lot of the people there. And when he wrote this whole journal, they came out and concluded that all these years we were wrong. It's really a nice Christian ministry organization. There's really nothing wrong with it, and we should kind of usher it into the world of Christianity. Problem is they have a history of suing other Christians over
they
their
being
name.
the local church has
the local church. That's the name of the group. The local church has sued several organizations, SEP, and writers back in the 80s who wrote against them. They recently sold. Most recent was they sued John Ankerberg over a book that he wrote on cults, naming them as a cult in the book. And they sued John Ankerberg and the publisher Harvest House for $138 million. And Hanegraaff wrote a friend of the court brief on behalf of the local church in the middle of this. They sued another Christian, supposedly, John Ankerberg and Harvest House, for $138 million. Now, the suit was thrown out by a group of judges in Texas, because that's where the suit was brought. And so they never got the money, and it all sort of went bad for the local church. But for Hank Hanegraaff to come out and say it's a Christian organization, there has to be some kind of quid pro quo here. They got something for it. They just didn't get a trip to China, I don't believe. I mean, I can't prove they got money or stock options or anything.
Right, so we don't have hard proof. We're just inferring this based on his past actions.
His history shows me that he never does anything that doesn't help Hank Hanegraaff.
Well,
he never has.
I think that's laid out pretty clearly in the book. Ladies and gentlemen, the book was called Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff and His Takeover the Christian Research Institute. Jay, where can people go to find this book?
Well, we have a website that talks about the ministry. It's found at focusonthefaulty.org. That's focusonthefaulty.org. We have our CDs for my lectures, because for 34 years I've had a seminar ministry. I travel around the country and do seminars in churches and colleges. My CDs are there. They can buy a copy of the book if they want to learn more about this situation, because it's Hank Hanegraaff is still around, and he's going to be around for a while. So the book still is relevant, I believe. But the book's available. They can go. We have articles that they can read about the different issues that my ministry deals with. But our ministry is sort of the heart and soul of what we do is on that website. And like I said, I've been doing this for 34 years, since '83. So we've been around for quite a while.
Jay, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. Thanks very much for your time, Jay.
Well, thanks for your time, Paul. I appreciate it.